Hey everybody, Flying Brian here at Orlando Executive Airport in Orlando, Florida. As with most Central Florida aviators, this airport played a major part in my aviation career. I spent 15 years based and flying here from the 80s and 90s, but I knew very little of the airport's very interesting and rich past. In fact, it wasn't until I left Orlando in the aviation business that I became more curious about the story behind the airport. From what I can find, it looks like in the early 1920s, someone may have carved out a grass landing strip from the orange groves that once grew north of Lake Underhill. Whoever did this likely had no idea this would forever change the future of this then remote area of Orlando. Perhaps city leaders recognized the importance of this burgeoning field of aviation, because in 1928, the city formally opened the Orlando Municipal Airport on 65 acres of land bordering the north and west side of Lake Underhill. When the airport first opened, one must keep in mind that aviation was still in its infancy. Most aircraft were not much more than flying kites made of wood and fabric. To make matters worse, just 2 years after it opened, the nation plunged headlong into the Great Depression, which certainly hindered the growth of this new and exciting form of transportation. No airlines served the airport. In fact, airlines were still a rarity at this time. The only regular flights came in the form of U.S. mail carriers. It wasn't until the late 1930s that events a half a world away were about to have a dramatic, permanent, and very positive impact on Orlando and its airport. As 1939 came to an end, war was raging in Europe, and it was becoming increasingly clear that America would be involved in the conflict. In 1940, the U.S. Army took over the airport, and on 1 September, the Orlando Army Air Base went active and thus began the start of the airfield's military service. The Army immediately set about improving and expanding the airport by adding runways and other facilities. Initially, fighter and bomber pilots were trained here. However, the Army was also busy building airfields all over Florida, and they had other plans for Orlando. Eventually, bomber and fighter training was moved elsewhere, some of which went to the newly opened Pine Castle Army Air Base, some 7 miles south. By this time, the military had vastly expanded and improved the airport. It went from 65 acres to over 1,000 and now had 6 paved runways. While training activities moved, they were replaced with other duties. Among them, the Army flew patrol sorties from Orlando to augment U.S. Navy and Coast Guard anti-submarine patrols along the coasts of Florida. Later, the Army moved their School of Applied Tactics here. In addition to testing new aircraft, new aviation tactics were being developed and put to the test in an effort to better use aircraft against the enemy. As World War II wound down, the base became a separation center where thousands of servicemen left the military and started back to civilian life. It was 1946 when the Army formally returned the now substantially improved airport to the city of Orlando, and it once again became the Orlando Municipal Airport, thus ending the airfield's military service. However, even with the airport returned to the city, the Army still maintained non-flying administrative and training facilities in areas west and north of the airfield. Then, in 1947, the military separated the Army Air Corps from the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Air Force was born. These properties went to the newly formed U.S. Air Force, who had less and less need for the facilities as the years went by. Eventually, the Air Force transferred these areas to the U.S. Navy, which longtime Orlandoans will know became the Orlando Naval Training Center. By 1999, the last remaining vestiges of the training center were erased from the landscape, and it too faded into history. But I digress. Back to the Orlando Municipal Airport. Shortly after the military returned the airport to the city, National Airlines and Eastern Airlines both started providing regular airline service to the airport in 1946. However, they did so without a proper airline terminal. It took the city another 5 years, but in 1951, an airline terminal was ready for use, which also incorporated a brand new control tower. By the early 1960s, airlines were starting to make the transition from propeller to jet aircraft. Even with the new and longer runway 7 that was added in 1959, The runways at Orlando Municipal were proving too short for the new jets. The city was unable to extend the runways any further due to surrounding development. This signaled the beginning of the end of commercial airline operations at the airport. City officials began talks with the U.S. Air Force in the hopes of obtaining access to the McCoy B-52 SAC base 7 miles south for joint civil-military use. Successful in their negotiations, the city prepared for moving airline operations to the larger SAC base, which they called Orlando Jetport. They started by renaming Orlando Municipal in 1961 to Herndon Airport after city engineer Pat Herndon. By 1968, all airlines had transferred their operations to the Jetport, leaving Herndon Airport as a general aviation facility serving private and commercial aviation concerns. The airline terminal would never again see airline passengers and was repurposed to house flight schools, Showalter Flying Service, and other uses. The airport was renamed again in 1982 to Orlando Executive Airport by the Greater Orlando Aviation Authority, a trend that continues today as many general aviation airports have incorporated the term executive in their name, likely to entice business flights to the airport. A new control tower was constructed, and in 1995, ATC Operations abandoned the antiquated facility in the old airline terminal for the modern facility on the south side of the airport. In 1999, the city demolished the original 1950s-era airline terminal and tower. It replaced it with a modern general aviation terminal to better serve the needs of the airport patrons. The airport remains an important part of the Central Florida general aviation community. The FAA reports that the airfield has over 150,000 annual operations, made up of a diverse mix of business jets, flight training, charter operations, private aircraft, helicopters, airships, and more. Looking out across the airport today, it's hard to imagine this is a quiet orange grove, with no more than the rustling of leaves and the occasional caw of a crow. That is exactly how this all started nearly 100 years ago. Remember, life is a journey. Enjoy the ride. And thanks for watching.